Johnny Depp stood on the corner of a street in Chicago, thoughtfully smoking a cigarette and watching the reflections of lights in the puddles. The evening was rainy, the rain having just passed, leaving the streets wet and gleaming under the glow of street lamps. Black clouds were slowly breaking apart, and despite the rain, the city felt alive and vibrant. He thought about where to have dinner. He wanted something simple and familiar, something that would bring him peace. He didn't feel like going to some trendy restaurant or looking for something new. He remembered a place he had once opened himself. A restaurant he hadn't visited in a long time. He remembered its atmosphere, quiet and cozy, just like it was when he first started. But since then, a lot had changed, and Johnny began to doubt whether this place still evoked the same emotions in him. His steps led him to the familiar sign. The same style, the same sign he had chosen himself. But now everything looked somehow different. He stood in front of the door, deciding that perhaps this was the place where he needed to spend the evening. That restaurant, which had once become a part of his life, had become something more than just a business. It was his corner, his little piece of the city. Or at least, that's how it used to be. The door creaked open, and Johnny stepped inside. The air was filled with the smell of freshly cooked food and a slight dampness from the rain. A few guests were sitting at the bar, laughing and chatting. The atmosphere was just as he had expected, warm, but something was off. He felt it right away. The bartender, a young guy with a hairstyle that looked like it came from a glossy magazine, didn't notice him at first. Johnny walked up to the counter, but the bartender kept cleaning glasses as if he wasn't there. And that's when Johnny realized, something had changed here. Maybe I'm just mistaken, Johnny thought, but at that moment the bartender finally turned to him, and not recognizing him, said, "We're sorry, sir, but we have strict rules regarding the appearance of our guests." Johnny froze, not immediately understanding what was happening. His gaze slipped over his reflection in the mirror behind the bar, ordinary, in jeans, a black shirt, and slightly stubbled. Everything seemed usual, but for this place, it wasn't enough. At some point, it almost felt like they wouldn't let him into his own home. What the hell? Flashed through his mind. Johnny stood in front of the bartender, not understanding what was happening. It seemed like everything should be simpler. He was the owner of this place, but now someone was standing in front of him as if deciding who was worthy of entering. There was no joy or surprise in the bartender's eyes. Only a calm, professional, almost detached attitude. I'm the owner of this restaurant," Johnny said, trying to maintain his composure. His voice sounded somewhat muffled in the silence that suddenly hung in the air. The bartender, without hesitation, looked at him again with an expression Johnny couldn't immediately understand. It was as if he didn't quite believe his words, as if a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. "Sorry, sir, but we have rules. I can't let you in looking like that." Johnny stood there, confused. He felt a pressure growing in his chest. For a moment, everything around him froze. The rain continued outside, and the sound of raindrops combined with the silence in the restaurant created a strange sense of detachment from reality. The world outside kept on with its life, but here, in this small corner of Chicago, it felt as though everything had collapsed. What's wrong with this place? Johnny thought. He remembered opening the restaurant, with a dream to create a place where people could feel at home. A cozy corner where warmth and hospitality prevailed. But now, everything was different. He looked around, trying to understand what had changed. The restaurant looked the same as it did the day he opened it. The same interior, the same wallpaper, the same tables, but the people sitting there were strangers to him. They were unfamiliar, just like this situation. And everything seemed as if his restaurant no longer belonged to him. It had become something else, something beyond his control. "Let me speak to the manager," he said, trying not to show his disappointment. Deep down, Johnny couldn't believe what was happening. The bartender tilted his head, looking at him in confusion. "The manager isn't working at this time," he replied. "If you want, I can take your details, and he'll get in touch with you." Johnny shrugged. He couldn't believe his restaurant had become this place. He was the owner, but now he was being denied entry like any other outsider. His irritation began to grow. Why, as the owner, was he on the side where they wouldn't let him in? Why did this situation feel so absurd, and what was happening to his restaurant? He looked around the room again, this time more attentively. Among the guests was someone sitting by the window, an old acquaintance to whom he had once given a discount, and now probably didn't recognize him. Waiters approached him, bringing dishes, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Johnny felt a strange sense that he was a stranger in his own home. Johnny felt anger boiling up inside him. He was already used to people disagreeing with him, to the fact that he often had to fight through numerous difficulties. But here, in his own restaurant, this feeling was something new. He had always been the boss, always controlled everything that happened, and now he was being denied what rightfully belonged to him. At that moment, all his confidence began to shake. He walked up to the bartender, deciding it was time to take action. "Listen," Johnny said, trying to keep his voice calm, "I really want to speak to the manager. I need to understand what's going on in my restaurant." The bartender looked at him again, surprised, but it seemed he had now accepted his words. He took a step back, and without turning around, shouted, "Hey, Rachel, come here." A woman in her 30s came out from the kitchen, a determined look on her face. Johnny recognized her. She had worked at the restaurant a couple of years ago, but he'd never been that close to her. He expected her to greet him warmly, with a smile, as an old friend, but her face was cold, even stern. "Do you need something?" she asked, not smiling. Johnny frowned, standing before her, unable to understand what was happening. "I'm the owner of this place. I want to go into my own restaurant," he said, trying to hide his disappointment. "This isn't some silly check. I just want to have dinner." Rachel looked at him as if she didn't understand what he was talking about. "There are no exceptions for owners," she said, her voice becoming firmer. "We have rules. We have a strict policy. I can't break them for you." He noticed how her eyes slid over his appearance, his unshaven face, his clothes, which, although simple, seemed insufficient in their eyes. She kept standing, as if waiting for him to say something else, but she clearly wasn't planning on taking a step toward him. Johnny stood in silence, trying to make sense of what was happening. He felt the internal control he had always kept slipping away from him. He had run this restaurant for a long time, but now his place had become foreign, and he himself felt almost powerless. "I don't understand what's happening," he said, holding back his irritation. "I put my soul and my time into this place. This restaurant was my baby, and now I'm here as a stranger?" Rachel didn't respond. She simply stared at him with the same expression, as if Johnny wasn't the owner to her, but just another guest with complaints. He realized that his place in the restaurant was no longer what it once was. The restaurant had changed, and not only had the staff changed, but the atmosphere and even the clientele had. It all felt like a heavy burden he didn't know how to handle. His gaze fell again on those sitting in the hall. The faces of the guests were unfamiliar, just like the restaurant itself, and even this moment seemed completely out of place to Johnny. He couldn't understand what had happened to the place that had once been his. He couldn't understand how everything had changed while he wasn't there. "This is too weird," he said, turning to leave. But as soon as he took a step toward the door, Rachel stopped him. "You can come back if you follow the rules." He turned around. There was something in her voice that he couldn't grasp. He didn't know what it was, not indifference, not politeness, but rather a challenge. Suddenly, he realized that maybe the entire situation wasn't just a misunderstanding. The restaurant had really changed. And he wasn't ready to accept it. Johnny walked down the street, heading toward his car. His thoughts were muddled, mixed together. He couldn't take his eyes off the restaurant standing right in front of him, exactly the same as it had been years ago when he first started. But now, this place was no longer his. Everything he had once loved and believed in seemed so distant and foreign. He sat in his car, trying to make sense of what had happened. How could he have lost control so easily over something he had created? The restaurant had been more than just a business to him, it was something deeply personal. He remembered how every corner, every detail had been chosen with love and care. But now everything had changed, and he didn't know how to return to what it had once been. After a few minutes of reflection, he decided to go back. At first, he had wanted to leave, to forget about it all, but now the feeling of injustice and alienation wouldn't let him rest. He felt that he had to understand what was going on. This was his place, and he couldn't allow himself to be pushed out of his own life. When he entered the restaurant again, the atmosphere was the same, but now it felt even more alien. People sat at tables, talking, enjoying their dinner. The bartender was at his post, but his gaze was now as hard as stone. Rachel, whom he had met earlier, was no longer there. She had disappeared, and in her place was another manager, a tall man with short hair, sitting at a table in the corner, talking on the phone. Johnny made his way toward him, deciding not to waste any more time. "Excuse me," he said, approaching. "I want to talk to you. I'm the owner of this restaurant." The manager looked at him, not immediately recognizing him, and hesitated for a moment. Then his face became more rigid, as if he was preparing for an unpleasant situation. "Of course," he said, putting the phone down and standing up. "How can I help you?" Johnny felt his inner irritation growing again, but he held it in check. "I want to understand what's going on in my restaurant. Why wasn't I allowed in? Why am I now a stranger in my own place?" The manager gave a slight smile, and it made Johnny feel as though he had been pushed aside once more. "The problem is that this restaurant no longer operates the way it used to," he said, his tone calm but confident. "There are new policies, new standards. It's all part of a corporate strategy. We have strict measures in place to maintain the establishment's image, and now customers' appearances matter just as much as their behavior." Johnny felt his head begin to spin from disappointment. "So, what, I can't enter my own restaurant because I don't meet the appearance standards?" His voice slightly trembled with anger. The manager nodded briefly. "Unfortunately, yes. These are the new rules. They were introduced recently, and we have to follow them." Johnny stood in silence, as if his life had been pulled off its usual track. He glanced around at the guests sitting in the hall. Some of them looked completely unfamiliar, as though they were only here because the place had become trendy, not because it had been something special. He didn't see the regulars, the ones who used to fill the tables, the ones with whom he often conversed and whose stories had mattered to him. He felt helpless. He wasn't just the owner, he was now a stranger in his own restaurant. "Don't you get it?" the manager continued, noticing his silence. "We all work by standards here. We can't afford to let everything slide. And if you, as the owner, want to have privileges here, you need to conform to the policy." Johnny didn't know how to respond. Everything seemed absurd. His restaurant had become no longer his own, just another part of something much larger. He stood before the manager, trying to understand what had happened during his absence. In that moment, it occurred to him that maybe his entire life had changed too. This wasn't just something happening in the restaurant. It was part of his personal transformation. He couldn't return to what had been because he had changed, and the restaurant had changed along with him. Johnny sat at a table in the corner of his restaurant, staring at the reflections shimmering on the glass surfaces. He was alone, and this place was truly his, but only in memory. Here, within these walls, he had once built his life. And now, instead of enjoying his success, he felt everything slipping away from under his feet, like sand running through his fingers. He knew he could no longer get back what he had lost. The restaurant he had opened had become part of something much bigger: business, trends, corporate rules. It was no longer just a commercial project but a symbol of how change affects every aspect of life. And perhaps he, too, had become like this place, just a part of something that no longer belonged to him. He stood up and walked to the counter where he had once greeted guests, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee and roasted spices had lingered. The bartender, whom he had met earlier, noticed his approach and stepped aside, ready for any command. But Johnny didn't order anything. He just stood there, his eyes filled with sadness and realization. "What happened to this place?" he asked, almost softly, but his words seemed to hang in the air. The bartender paused, not answering immediately. "We're all here by the rules," he said. "This isn't just a restaurant. It's a brand." Johnny smiled bitterly. He knew his words would change nothing. He was already a stranger here, even if he could bring everything back. No matter what he did, the restaurant had become part of a new reality. A reality where the owner no longer mattered. Where only profit, image, and rules mattered, leaving no room for personal connections or individuality. At that moment, Johnny realized that he had lost more than just control over the restaurant. He had lost his connection to what had been real in his life. He had lost his soul, which had once poured so much effort into this project. He had become part of what he had once despised, alienated, impersonal, detached from everything that had mattered. He returned to his car, and without turning on the music, he drove into the night. The rain was the same outside, but now it seemed different. He felt that the rain was washing him clean of guilt and disappointment, that he needed to let go. But despite this, a void remained in his soul. He understood that he could never be the person he had once been. Everything had changed, and he would have to learn to live with it.